For the last couple months here at Sunnyslope, we've been looking at the theme of relationships. We've done that really since the beginning of June, and kind of in the back of my mind through this whole couple months, really through this whole summer, there's been this. It's kind of a nagging concern that I've had, and I've kind of had to push it off just a little bit until today. The concern is this: we've talked a lot. We've talked first about kind of the church as a series of relationships, right? We've looked at how when you become a Christian, the church or Jesus draws you into really a new family, gives you a new network of people that we're to be committed to and invested in. And then we started to get a little more specific, and we've been talking about. We spent some time talking about marriage, and then last week we talked a little bit more about family. And the theme in all of this has been what happens when the gospel is worked into and sort of kneaded through these different relationships. And here's where my concern has kind of been, that nagging concern in the back of my mind, is that especially the last 4 or 5 weeks when we've talked about marriage and family, and the concern is that there's probably, a third of you that are not married. And that's been a concern to me more on the pastoral side, because I don't want anybody to feel like you're on the outside, that you're kind of a spectator here. I realize the Bible talks a lot about marriage. The Bible talks a lot about sexuality. The Bible talks a lot about family, and so it's important to not ignore those things. But I also, so I felt I couldn't just walk away from them. But I did have that sense that we somehow have to find a way to look at the bigger picture. And so this morning we're looking at single folks. And we're asking the question, and we're looking at the theme: what happens when the gospel is applied to the life of a single person? And this can mean whether you're in your 20s or 30s and you're not married yet. It could be if you've been married but you've gone through a divorce, or it could be if you've lost a spouse at some point in your life. What happened? How does the gospel change that experience? What does the gospel mean for single people? And what Paul is talking to us about this morning is really exactly that, but specifically he's going to show us how the gospel creates hope. The gospel creates hope, and when we believe that hope, when we have that and hold fast to that hope, that changes how we live, whether you're married or single. Okay, so in a nutshell, there it is. We're going to look at how the gospel creates hope that changes married and single people. Now, if you're a single person, you know that there's kind of an undercurrent, I think, in our present world that says if you're single, you may not be complete. Now, it's not true, but you may have experienced kind of those undercurrents, and maybe here's how that can sometimes come out. Maybe you've had well-meaning, well-intended relatives come to you, and they'll say something like, you know what? You really ought to meet my cousin's nephew's boyfriend's coworker's sister. You'd be perfect for each other. Right? And again, well-intentioned probably, most times, well-meaning, but there's that undercurrent there that says, I see that you're single and I want to help you fix that. I want to get someone for you so that you're complete now. There's also the other dynamic here, the other side of it, which is that singleness can be a very lonely place to be. I talked with a friend of mine who's single a little while back, and he says, I keep busy with a lot of different things. I've got, work, and I've got, extended family, and I've got hobbies and so on and so forth. He says, but then every once in a while I come home at night, and if I don't have anything else going, he says that, and this is his language, he said that crushing weight of loneliness begins to settle in. Right? If you're a single person, maybe you've experienced that, right? Our world, even though I think we've seen a change in the last probably 20 years where marriage is not, it's not elevated the way it once was. Like, it's not assumed that everybody needs to get married, but it is still assumed that you need to be in a relationship. And if you're not in a relationship, you're not complete. And then you begin to wonder, if you're a single person, where do I fit in this world? Where's my place? You can feel disconnected. You can feel alone. You can feel like you don't fit. And if we're really honest, and if we're really not careful, this can creep into the church, right? If we gear all of our ministries to married people, we unintentionally, perhaps, we can marginalize those who are not married. Right? I think that's the temptation and the struggle that we can face as a church, and that's maybe some of the things that you've experienced if you are a single person. Now, first century Greco-Roman times, in some ways things were very different, but in other ways, these very same issues were at work in the Church of Corinth and in other churches. And I want to show you just something very simple here, but I'll show you kind of what we're getting at. If you look with me, and we didn't read this part this morning, but chapter 7, verse 1. Look with me there for a moment. And we're only going to look at the first part of the sentence there. Paul says, "Now for the matters you wrote about." Let me just explain why Paul says it that way. Paul has spent the first 6 chapters of this letter to the Corinthians talking about some of the concerns that he, their pastor, has had about their church. And so he goes on for 6 chapters and he addresses many of these things. Now chapter 7 marks a transition. Paul's changing gears. And really what he's doing is he's pulling out the mailbag and he's saying, okay, I know that you had some questions for me. And now I want to take some time and I want to answer those questions. And one of the questions that the Corinthian church had was, well, where do single people fit? Where do single people fit? Now, in first century Corinth, the problem was there were at least 2 layers to it. The first was a very practical problem. If you were a single person, especially if you were a widow, the challenge facing you was that you didn't have the same social network that you needed for basic survival. You know, if your husband passed away and now you're a woman, you're very vulnerable. There's no Social Security, there's no, Medicaid, Medicare, those kinds of things. There's nothing really, you depended on family to take care of you, and if they would not or could not, you had no one. And so as a single person, you're vulnerable. Right? Now in fact, there's even some literature that's been found that says, or some indication that says, one of the Roman emperors, I forget which one it was, but he instituted a fine. If you did not remarry within a certain span of time after your spouse died, you could be fined. The police would come and write you a ticket or however they did it. You'd be fined. You had to remarry. So there you're beginning to see, if you're an unmarried person, you're in a very vulnerable position socially. But now the Corinthians took this a step further. One of the problems in the whole church of Corinth, and it's a theme that you'll find through the whole book, was really this: how do you measure spirituality? How do you determine who really has the Spirit of God working in their life? Who is really on fire for the Lord? And the Corinthians, it seems, had a totem pole. And at the very top, the most spiritual people, the people that felt that they were better than everyone else, were the people who could speak in tongues. Because if you could speak in tongues, you must be really spiritual. Okay, so that's at the top. Now, it seems they had other criteria that they used to measure other aspects of spirituality. And one of those other criteria was, are you married? And if you were married, it was seen as a sign of God's favor, and He blessed you, and you're better than others. You're a little higher up on the totem pole. So if you're married and you can speak in tongues, you're really near the top. And if you're a single person and you don't speak in tongues, you're near the bottom. So Paul's going to address that. And he's going to show what the gospel looks like when we apply it. But look at how Paul does this. Look at the framework that he's using. Look with me first at chapter 7, verse 25. And let's be honest, the language here is a little bit unfortunate when Paul says now about virgins. We hear that to mean Paul talking about a person with no sexual experience. In Paul's day, he's really speaking there more about an engaged person, a betrothed person who's not yet been married. But anyways, we go on. I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Now that might seem a little odd to us. Paul says, well, I don't have anything to say that comes from God, but let me tell you anyways. But here, so we might be tempted to say, well, this isn't binding on us. That's not what Paul is saying. Here's what really Paul is saying. He's saying, look, Jesus never taught on this subject. Jesus never led a singles retreat. He never pulled all the people away and said, let's talk about, now, I know you're single, so let me explain some things you need to know. He never did that. So Paul cannot say, well, you all remember what Jesus said, and then tell them. He can't do that. He says, Jesus never taught on this. But he says, by God's grace, I'm trustworthy. He's saying, I'm speaking to you with authority, and we know in the bigger picture, Paul is working under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, so yes, this is still binding on us. But let's go a little further. In fact, let's jump to the end of the passage because Paul concludes this section by saying something else that's really helpful. The very last half sentence of verse 40, flip the page over. Here's how Paul concludes it, and he's just throwing this little phrase in here, and it would have exploded in the minds of the listeners. Paul says, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. One fell swoop, Paul is knocking down that totem pole. In effect, Paul is saying, you all know that I'm single, right? And the Corinthians would say, oh yeah. And Paul says, and I think you all would agree that I'm filled with the Spirit of God. Oh yeah. No more totem pole. No more, I'm more spiritual because I'm married. That's what Paul is doing. He's knocking down the totem pole. The measure of a person's spirituality is not their marital status. Now, let's go a little more specific. Verses 25 through 28, if you flip back the page, that's the framework Paul is operating out of. And then in verses 25 through 28, this is really the heart of what Paul is saying, and then he unpacks more of it in verses 29 and following. But it boils down to this. Paul is saying, whether you're married or single, one is not right and the other wrong, morally speaking. Marriage or unmarriage is not a question of morality. Paul's going to say there's some advantages to being single in a minute, but he's saying if you're an unmarried person, don't be in a rush to go and find that spouse. When I was in college, we sometimes had that, I forget even the language we called it, but we sort of talked about, if you're in your senior year and you haven't married yet, you better get your act together. You better go find someone because you're running out of time, right? That was the mindset. Right? So Paul's saying, no. If you're single, don't be in a rush to get married. And if you're married, don't end your marriage. Don't break up. Don't get in a divorce. Stay as you are. The gospel's changed the perspective here. Right? If you're married, stay married. If you're single, don't be in a rush to go and find a spouse. Now, the question is, why not? Why does Paul say, married or single, don't be in a rush to change things up? Don't feel like you need to change your status. Well, look with me at verse 26. Here's the answer to that. Because of the present crisis, I think that it's better that you remain as you are. Now that begs a question, doesn't it? What's the crisis? Well, the answer is we don't know for sure. Different thoughts and different ideas have been put out. If you read the experts, some will say, well, there was a food shortage. There was famine. So if you run off and get married, now you're not only having to worry about yourself, but you also have to make sure you're feeding your spouse, and that's going to create economic strain. Others have said, well, politically, things were changing in Rome, and if you were a Christian, persecution was only increasing, and so if you are single and you go and you get married, and now persecution breaks out, and now you're hauled off to jail, now you've left your spouse all alone. So don't be in a hurry to get married. There's some other thoughts and theories on that, but I don't think either of those or any of the other ones are really accurate except for one. I'll show you, and let's look from the text because I think we can get the answer very clearly from what the text says. Look with me at verses 30 and 31. Verse 31, end of verse 31. Paul says, "For this world, in its present form, is passing away." Now, we might be inclined to hear that as, well, this world is dissolving into ashes and cinders and into nothingness, but that's not quite what Paul is getting at here. Paul is working out of the framework of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what Paul is saying is that when Jesus died and then was resurrected into new life, that opened the door to a brand new future, to something great and glorious that until that point had not yet been realized. A new future dawned the moment Jesus rose from the dead. A future that was free from sin, suffering, darkness, sadness, sickness, death, disease. All of those things have been defeated. All of those things are passing away. Moreover, all the structures, powers, principalities of this world are temporal. They don't last. This world as we know it is passing away and giving way to this bright and glorious future that Jesus has guaranteed for us and opened for us through his resurrection. His resurrection was a resurrection into new life, life that will continue into eternity. And Paul is saying, if you're living for this world, it's all passing away, it's all going to be gone, and don't live for that. Now let me show you a little more what I mean by that. You have to understand, what you believe about the future, what you are confident in about the future shapes how you live in the present. If you believe that human beings are nothing more than molecules and really bags of organic compounds, complex organic chemicals and such, and if you believe that this world is going to dissolve into nothingness and forever fade away and we all just sort of disappear like a little spot of light that just goes out on the horizon or something of that sort, how's that going to shape how you live in the moment? Well, it's hard to find meaning if that's all that you believe that life really is. It's hard to find a sense of ultimate purpose if you believe that in the end everything collapses into nothing. So what Paul is saying is if you believe that this present world will pass away and give way to the bright and glorious future that Jesus has opened for us at the resurrection, then we live that out in the present. Let me show you how. Verses 30 and 31. He says, actually beginning at the second part of verse 29, from now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. Now, Paul is not saying if you're a married person, go off and you can philander around with whoever you want. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, don't find your ultimate sense of meaning and hope in marriage. He goes on, those who mourn as if they did not. He's not saying, pretend that you're never sad. He's saying, remember that the certainty of the future means that death is not permanent for those who are in the Lord. Those who are happy as if they were not. Again, he's not saying walk around with sad faces all the time and never experience joy. He's saying don't find your happiness in the things of this world. Going on, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. He's really saying don't acquire and accumulate material goods as though somehow that's going to give you long-term eternal security. Those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. And there Paul drives that point home. If you believe that the future is the eternal presence of God in living for him, then don't get all caught up in using and being engrossed in the things of this world. What we believe about the future shines light on how we live in the present. Your confidence about the future shapes how you live today. And as Christians, we call that hope. That's what hope is. Hope isn't just fuzzy optimism. It's not just kind of this vague idea that somehow things will work out okay. Hope is we believe in what Jesus has already done and promises to do in the future. And so Christian hope then shapes mourning, happiness, marriage, materialism, and so on. Now, let's look a little more specifically then. In light of the future, if this is what we believe about the future, how do we live today? Well, big picture, let's start with verse 35. Here's where Paul summarizes it. In fact, this is, if you're looking for the core truth of what Paul is getting at here, verse 35 is it. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. The question is, what is eternal? What lasts forever? Right? Paul is saying, remember, we have this bright and glorious future ahead, living with Jesus for the rest of eternity. Are you living today in light of that certainty? Are you investing yourself, your time, your energy, your talents just in living for yourself in the present moment, or are you investing in eternity? When you get up and go to work tomorrow, are you doing this as though you are serving the Lord? Or are you doing this as though you are trying to serve yourself, your own interests? Are you pouring yourself in to what really matters? Are you spending your money in such a way that it reflects your hope in eternity? Are you using your time in such a way that others can see that you have a vision for eternity? Are you using the gifts that God has given you in such a way that it shows that you are confident about eternity? Are you investing in things that last, or are you pouring yourself into things that are temporal? Paul says, I want you to live in undivided devotion to the Lord. Now, here's where Paul says that actually married people have a disadvantage. If you're a married person, this actually can become more difficult. Paul says he actually says it twice, in verse 33, and then again in verse 34, he says, a married man, is concerned about the affairs of the world. Right? A married person, Paul says elsewhere, a married person can have divided loyalties. In other words, a married person has the disadvantage of needing to care for home and family. And Paul does not say those are bad things. He doesn't say you shouldn't be married, but he acknowledges that marriage can actually lead to divided loyalties. And if you're a married person, especially if you have a family, you can actually begin to see how this plays out. Right? How quick it can happen that things like sports, school, caring for, running your kids around this place and that place, all of those other things can so quickly crowd out devotion to the Lord. If you're a married person, you can get so caught up in just living life together and looking out for each other, caring for each other, and so on, that pretty soon devotion to the Lord and your commitment to serving Him just gets pushed over to the margins. And that becomes secondary. And then third on the list, and fifth, and finally, it's just not a priority. And marriage can do that. Marriage doesn't have to. It's not an automatic thing. But that's something that married couples have to contend with. So, now let's get more specific. How does hope help you and I to live devoted to the Lord? Now, Paul addresses married couples in this text, and so we're going to spend just a couple minutes on talking about that, and then we're going to focus on how does that help and what does it mean for single people. The first is this. Verse 36 and 39, Paul, he's not saying marriage is a sin. He acknowledges that marriage can be a calling from God, and so he gives some practical instructions. In verse 36, he's talking to people who are engaged or they're betrothed, but it's like in today's language we say it's a long engagement. And if Paul is really saying if you're delaying this engagement, then maybe if you're really committed, then you need to go ahead and get married, is in effect what he's saying. And Paul, again, is working out of the framework that says sex belongs within the covenant of marriage. And so if you're engaged and you're delaying that, don't put the extra temptation and the extra strain on the relationship. If you're committed to one another, then get married. Don't think that this is a sin. So in today's language, we'd maybe say, if you believe that God has brought you together, then don't stretch out your engagement for months or years on end. The second thing that Paul says in verse 39, Paul is addressing widows. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. In other words, Paul is saying, don't think that I'm telling you must not and may not ever remarry. Paul is saying you are free to do so. The only stipulation, and this applies across the board to young, old, married, or widows or otherwise, you must marry in the Lord. Now, Paul he can kind of anticipate an objection, right? Paul seems to be saying, puts the emphasis on singleness, and Paul can imagine someone saying, well, Paul, you make it sound like singleness is actually better. So maybe I should just go and leave my spouse. Maybe I should seek a divorce. Then I can be single. Then I can really serve the Lord. And to that, Paul says, no. Verse 39, marriage is for life. You're joined together. You can't just end a marriage just because and say that, well, God told me to do this because I can serve Him better now. Paul says, no, you can't do that. Marriage is for life. Now, what does this mean if you're a single person here? Whether you're young and you've never been married, whether you're a widow, you've lost your spouse, whether you're divorced, what does this mean for single folks? There are two things that I want to draw your attention to. And by the way, Paul is not saying do some spiritual things until you can wait to get married. Then life really begins. No, he's not looking at marriage like that. He's saying whether you're single for a season or whether it's a lifelong thing, here's how you need to devote your attention. Verse 32. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Right, there's the first thing. As a single person, you have a unique opportunity to use this time, to steward this time, to be committed to seeking the Lord's things, the kingdom of God. You have an opportunity to pour yourself into caring for others in the life of the church in ways that married people might be a little more difficult for them. Mentoring someone in the community, caring for the poor among us, right? Volunteering to serve in the life of the church. All those things are, and those are just some examples, but Paul is saying you have the opportunity to use this as a unique experience to serve God and to seek His purposes in ways that it might be more difficult for a married person to do. The second thing, verse 34. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. Again, this is, in one way, this is something that all are called to do, but if you're a single person, you have the opportunity to steward this a little bit differently. What Paul is talking about here is the pursuit of holiness. To spend this time deepening your relationship with Jesus Christ. To spend this time growing into the image of Christ. Again, this is whether singleness is for a short season or for a much longer season. Paul says, devote yourself to holiness, to pursuing God in body and soul. He's talking about your dedication and your commitment to holiness. As a single person, you can do that in ways that might be more difficult for a married person. Now, I want to revisit, as we close, I want to revisit verse 27. Why can Paul say, are you married, don't seek a divorce? Are you unmarried, don't look for your wife? Don't look for a wife. In a culture that valued marriage and put it on a pedestal, and even today in a culture that says relationship is everything, if you're not in a relationship, you're incomplete. How can Paul say, married, single? Nah, in the light of the gospel, it's really all the same. The answer to that, the heart of all of this, comes down to identity. On what do we build our identity? Our culture says you build it, in part at least, on relationship. Relationship is one of those things that gives you higher standing. And Paul says, no. Our identity is not found in our marital status, whether you're married or single. So, married, single, Paul says, don't be in a hurry to change it. Our identity is found in Christ. Our identity is found in who we are in relationship to Jesus. Our sense of importance and worth are found in our relationship with Jesus and how God sees us through Christ. And you remember Jesus, here's someone who lived his whole life as a single person and yet lived in perfect devotion to his Father, lived in perfect obedience, lived the completely fulfilled life in every way. Right? Jesus is the one who shows us what singleness looks like, who shows us the picture of what it can be. And being joined to Christ and being united to Him, we find our identity in Him. We too can give ourselves in service to the Lord to pursue holiness that God calls us to. Married or single. Let's live with that hope. Let's have that vision of this world that God has opened to us in Christ. It's a vision that is for all people, married or single. The world says if you want hope, you need to be